Hi everyone, I'm Colin. Just fair warning, I'm going to try and make this session be a little bit audience interactive. I want to be able to demonstrate the actual value of doing this live. So it'll be the first time I've done it in this kind of context, but we'll give it a whirl and see how it goes. So, system mapping, hey? What the hell is all of that thing? Yeah, keep your interest. I've got some quotes to keep you interested as well. So, system mapping is a process that I evolved when after I'd started at REA Group some 8 years ago, thereabouts. This is 2018. And the goal was to try and understand what was the system, what was the REA system at that point in time. So what I've arrived at is a mechanism that is absolutely by no means complete. It's not an off-the-shelf tool that you can just buy. It's a way of exploring what's already there. Not only that, it's also very useful for helping other people find out and explore what's already there as well. People who, for whatever reason, may have been around for a long time or are brand new to the organisation, people who think they know where all of the things are and where the bodies are buried, and find out that they don't actually know quite so well as they thought they did once you start the process. It's a way that you can share what you discover within the organisation, across teams, and even outside the organisation as well. Because this is system mapping as code, you can commit the code to a source code repository and share it with other people as well. And we'll actually do that in the interactive session later on. It's documentation as well. Who loves building architecture diagrams? Okay. I'm marking you three out. How useful and accurate are they? There's a certain level of license that you have to take with reality, right? So system mapping as a discovery process tries to fill in all of that license that you've left out because you couldn't quite get Visio to jam it into that box, right? Yeah, smaller font, then people can't read it, right? All right. So this is a result of about a month's work of asking questions of people and mapping the dependencies. So it's an organisation in Melbourne, and this is a result of just asking people what there is, and then building the nodes in the graph and building the edges in the graph and working out what there is. That's what it looks like close up. That helps, right? Use a smaller font, you said. Yeah, nothing is going to help. All right. It's not just about mapping technological systems. That last one was dependencies between microservices in a real live production system. This one is about change flows. How does change flow through the system of work? From teams, through source code repositories, through build pipelines and build systems, which presumably run unit tests, through artifact repositories into production environments. And then there's monitoring and alerting and the feedback loops which go from those systems all the way back to the people who are empowered to do something about them when they break, which in this case, thankfully, is the development team, not the operations team, who would then be another node that would have to throw it over another wall. And that's what it looks like up close. Within teams as well. So this is an example of how decisions are made and work flows within a team. So some of you who are here from another customer of CEO's might recognize this. And the fonts on these are all way too small to actually be useful to anyone. So I'm not leaking any proprietary information here. But this is about who's involved and where are the decision points and what happens to the artifacts as they flow through the change process that the team has. And if you map team workflows in an organisation, almost guaranteed no two teams have the same workflow. So you just uncover all sorts of interesting and fascinating things. So now that you know what it is, the obvious question is why, right? Why on earth would you bother with such a crazy thing as system mapping? So when I introduce this to a lot of organisations, being a technology-based person myself, I'm built with technology, and talking as I do to a lot of people who work in the technology field, they often ask, why don't you implement library X, add this thing, and it'll capture all of the stuff and record it, and you get all of this for free. Yes, up to a point, and the point is where things start to fall down. It's not easy to just slap a tracing library on your systems. Those are changes that have to be made. It can take weeks, months, even years in some cases, to properly instrument a distributed system. And that system's changing all the time as well. You've got to have support in software for the tracing libraries that you choose to use. Some are higher quality than others based on where those tracing libraries have come from, if they're commercial, where the expertise of the company that writes them comes from, and if they're open source, where the interest of the open source community directs them. Most importantly, they don't cross non-technical boundaries. If you've got a system that's emitting some tracing information, and you've got this domain of understanding over here, and then you have another system that's doing the same thing, and they're both mapped, if the intersection between those two is Susan logs into this system and downloads a report and then publishes it as a CSV into that system via email, very unlikely that your tracing library is going to capture that. Distributed tracing also has the challenge of data currency and data storage. If you're collecting 1 billion data points a day, you've got to store it all somewhere. Eventually you've got to age it out, so you've got to, sometimes you may miss infrequent connections as well if you don't instrument every little bit. And it only maps data flows, it doesn't map those human process flows as well. So, system mapping is not about outputs, it's about outcomes, which is why we're all here as well, right? It's about the journey of discovery. It's about building that common shared understanding. For people who are visual learners, it's a great way to understand the complexity of the system that you're dealing with. If I had told you before this talk that, well, we have problems with upgrading this particular component of a system, if you had no idea about the system, and if you had no idea about software development, about operations, if you were a purely non-technical person, you may go, well, surely it's not that hard, it's just software, right? But if I showed you that initial systems map, which showed all of the components and the dependencies between them, you might look at it and go, well, hang on, that thing's got an enormous number of lines coming into it and going out of it. And I don't know what they do, and I don't know what that means. I can see that it's tightly connected to a whole bunch of things. Now I understand. Or maybe it's one of the ones around the periphery, and maybe it's because it's very infrequently touched and no one really understands what it does very well. Maybe it's a human system. They're hard to upgrade. It can help you discover the risks as well. In the example that I gave of Susan logs into this system and gets a report and uploads it via email to that system, that's effectively a real world case. The name wasn't Susan. Names have been changed to protect the innocent. But there are almost always dependencies like that in any sufficiently complex system. There are always nodes that have a human name. I haven't seen one yet that hasn't. If you've got data flows with fragile components in them, infrequent connections, stuff that happens every now and then, if you're sampling your data, then you may miss things as well. So this process can help you discover those things too. When you join an organisation, whether you're a consultant or a full-time employee, especially in a technical role, there's a learning curve. of technical systems, components that are changing, the rates of change, who owns them, what do they do, how do they fit in non-technical systems as well. What's the process? How do I file an expense report? How does that get approved? Who do I go to if that person isn't there? So you need to learn all of these systems, all of these processes with every new place that you go. We used to say at one of my previous employers that we couldn't allow someone to get into the production environment and start maintaining it until they had been there for 6 months because of the level of complexity. It was too fragile, it was too complex, and it was too easy to break things. With the advent of cloud-based systems and infrastructure and systems as code and so forth, that risk has been mitigated to a great deal. But even so, if we'd had something like one of those at the very beginning, we could have extracted a lot of that oral tradition of people who had already been there for years. They knew where the bodies were. Don't touch that thing. Or touch that thing, but you've got to leave that comma at the end of the line on line 12 because otherwise it blows up. We don't know why. It just does. So don't touch that one. I think I've covered a lot of this, haven't I? You can map technical and non-technical things in a manner which is accessible. One of the things that occurred to me this morning while I was sitting in another talk was that the other value of mapping as a collaborative process is the IKEA principle. So people tend to put a much higher value on something that they've had a hand in creating. If you think about this, you go to IKEA and you buy a set of shelves, you bring it home and you spend, depending on your level of handy capability, it might be half an hour, 2 hours, you might call your neighbour over to help you, whatever it may be, right? But you've been part of the construction of that thing and you tend to value it more highly. Whereas if you go to an op shop and you buy a second-hand pair of IKEA shelves, especially if they're a set that someone's glued together, you probably don't value them as highly, right? So it's like, oh, it's just like cheap crap that I got from the op shop, it'll be fine. So actually having, although it's the same set of shelving, having a hand in the construction of the thing causes you to value it more highly. And that helps build ownership of the system and the understanding of the system as a whole. Give me a second. All right, I'm not trying to sell you a tool or a package, no. So, something I hear fairly commonly is, oh, it can't work here. We can't do that in our organisation because there are always exceptions, right? There's that myth of exceptionalism. But because this is not about anything that's heavyweight, anything that's difficult to do, it's about people talking to people and using some fairly simple mechanisms, yeah, absolutely you can. You can start wherever you need to. It doesn't really matter where you start. Start with the person sitting next to you. Start with the most friendly team. Start with what you already know and work out from there. The analogy that I've used before is like, it's like pulling an octopus through a small pipe. I don't know if you've ever seen videos of octopuses going through small pipes. They can squeeze themselves down to amazingly small diameters and fit through tubes you would never think that they could get through. But it's like pulling on the tentacle of an octopus, and as the octopus comes out of the pipe, it gets bigger, and all of a sudden there's this bleh of tentacles coming out, and you go, oh my God, and then there's holding onto another octopus, like, oh crap, what's going on? How many octopuses are there going to be? And at the end, there's a cuttlefish. And it's kind of like that. So you start anywhere, you ask people what they know, you capture what they tell you, and the map evolves, and it iterates. The technique that I've used most successfully is to physically print it out, yes, with tiny fonts, and if necessary on A0 paper, so people can read the fonts. Stick it on the wall in a high traffic area and hang a pen next to it with a sign that says, this map is probably wrong, please update it. At the end of the week, you go back, take the map down, capture the changes, print out a new version, rinse and repeat, right? Keep doing that until either the rate of change slows down enough, or enough people walking past the map who have enough power to make decisions have gone, oh my God, this is why we can't have nice things, often enough that things start to change. In terms of actually building the map, when you're doing those face-to-face interactions with people and teams. What team seems to work best is, rather than having an auditorium full of people, although I'm going to do this with an auditorium full of people, we'll see how it works, get small teams who know about specific parts of the domain, specific components, specific pieces of the process. Smaller teams work better because the voices tend not to get drowned out. You go around the room and you ask people who look like they might have something to say or who simply haven't said anything yet, so what do you think about this? In a smaller group, you tend to find a lot more of the surprise discoveries. And you can then go on, you'll find an external component, and you can then go to the team that looks after that component or that process. And you can say, so I've heard about this. And they go, oh, let me tell you about that. All right. Finding the right level of granularity is tricky as well. Start where you start. If you find that you've just got too many components and too many connections and you're capturing too much, you've probably been capturing too much. So think about ways that you could maybe zoom out a little bit. If you're talking about microservice components in a network environment, you might have started off with, I've got one of these and I've got two of those and I've got five of those and these talk to a database on this protocol and that. An event rapidly becomes a gigantic ball of string that's not helpful to anyone. And so you shrink them down, you just have one node that is that microservice. And instead of protocols and all the different ones, you've just got, it has a dependency on. So that's a way that you can zoom out a little bit and make the map a little bit more legible. There, printing it on A0, getting ahead of myself. In true lean fashion, I wrote most of this talk last night. But system mapping is something I've been doing for a while, so the slides are more about making sure that I don't go too fast. Use of colour and shape is critically important, I've found. If all of the nodes were the same shape and the same colour, if they were all white ellipses and that was stuck up on a wall, from afar it would either look like a blank piece of paper or just a jumbled mess. As you got closer, it would just look like a jumbled mess of identical elliptical blobs. But by using colour and by using line shapes, line weights, line styles, by using borders, by using different shapes, you can transfer information about components of the system once people have understood what those colours and shapes mean, much faster than by having people actually have to read the piece of paper or read the electronic version. It doesn't really matter what colours and shapes you use, so long as once you start using them, you are consistent and keep using them, because people come to have the expectation that that's what they mean. I've got a set of colours and shapes that I've been using just because that's what I started with 8 years ago.